So I want to do a quick poll because I'm seeing some familiar faces and some new faces. And so I'm going to run this poll for all of you. And I want to know how familiar you are with Pulitzer Center resources. Are you very familiar? You've used center resources and programs in your classroom already? Somewhat familiar? You've looked at our website. I just skipped familiar. You've looked at their center resources, somewhat familiar or unfamiliar. You haven't heard about the programs and resources, and this is your first time. So I'm gonna hold maybe 15 more seconds for everyone to participate in this. And we're gonna close in 3, 2, 1. So it looks like some people are somewhat familiar. You've heard about the Pulitzer Center, but this might be an introduction for all of you. We do have some people that are very familiar. We're so happy you're here. And we're gonna share information that you may have heard already, but hopefully, if you have any questions about the fellowship or the center, we'll address those at the very end of this conversation. So the Pulitzer Center is a journalism organization dedicated to spreading awareness about underreported news stories across the globe. We partner with journalists, other news organizations and publications, educational institutions at the university and K-12 level to ensure that underreported stories are getting the attention that they deserve. Journalists pitch underreported stories that they are passionate about covering to us, and we provide funding for their projects. That funding supports journalists throughout the reporting process. This infographic captures just some of the publications where journalists grantees have published their stories. You may notice one that you follow or that you're familiar with. And if you do, share in the chat. We'd love to get to know your news habits. Pulitzer grantees cover a range of pressing global issues. Here is a collection of just some of the issues our journalists cover. If you're interested in a particular issue, you can always find the latest global stories around that issue at pulitzercenter.org/issues. You've probably heard me already say underreported stories a couple of times, and we haven't defined that term yet. We're gonna play a little snippet of this video that's gonna help us define that term. This video is gonna answer what an underreported story is, and we may not watch all of it, but if you continue to watch this video, it will also answer how you can find these stories in the news and in your community. Actually, before we play, Hannah, I want to go to the next slide really quick. So after this video, I'm going to ask this question. How can underreported stories support your goals for your students? And so I want you to be thinking about that as we watch those 90 seconds of this video.
Hi, I'm Steve Sapienza.
And I'm Nora Moraga Louie. We're members of the editorial team at the Pulitzer Center.
And we're here to talk about underreported stories, why they matter, and how you find them.
An underreported story covers an issue that is important, but isn't getting the attention it deserves.
These can be stories that aren't necessarily in the breaking news headlines, or they're covered, but missing critical perspectives and nuance.
Underreported stories, they're underreported for reasons. It usually has to do with our agenda setting.
It's driven by clicks and news cycles around things like disasters and elections. Of course, that doesn't tell the whole story about the world.
These are stories that can save lives. For example, we now know that there was far less coverage of the coronavirus issue in the first weeks of 2020 than we should have had, given what epidemiologists knew at the time. The last time there was a pandemic, in 1918, the same thing happened. The flu claimed millions of lives, but the virus barely made the front page because most news coverage focused on World War I.
Underreported stories raise awareness about issues we know little about. Reading them makes you a smarter citizen, better able to make informed decisions and useful contributions to society.
They also illuminate the deeper issues that we face as a society. They help us build empathy, expose corruption, hold the powerful accountable, find solutions to difficult problems, and affect change.
Thank you so much, Hannah. So I'm going to give you guys like 10 seconds to soak that in, and I'm hoping to answer this question. How can underreported stories support your goals for your students? I'd love to take a couple of volunteers if you feel comfortable to share out loud, but if you feel more comfortable in the chat, we can hold some time for that as well. So I'm going to give this about 20 seconds for you guys to have the space to respond to this question. And if you want to volunteer and speak, just raise your hand. I can see all of you. Thank you, Katie. So Katie's response is a great example of civic behavior they may not have considered. Anybody want to add some texture to Katie's contribution?
I'm Robert Renee. I did notice someone used the term student journalist, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I think that underreported stories are great ways of giving students that are studying journalism a means of coming up with story ideas to bring them to light and give more information to them. I'm not a fan of the term student journalist because journalists are journalists. Great.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Robert. We appreciate that feedback. Certainly finding stories is something that underreported stories and looking for them can help students do. So thank you for that contribution. I'm also seeing one in the chat. Colette has said, underreported stories are important to prepare students to become citizens in a democratic forum. Thank you for that contribution, Colette. I'm also seeing Danielle, get students to think critically about the world around them. Thank you so much for these wonderful contributions. We're going to move on, but if you have other thoughts, the chat is the space for you to share them. So our education mission is to cultivate a more curious, informed, empathetic, and engaged public by connecting students and teachers with unreported global news stories and the journalists who cover them. We understand that we can't fulfill this mission without the partnership of teachers, administrators, and students. And so we offer a number of free programs and resources for teachers and students, which I'm going to review in the next slide. So one of the most valuable resources we offer to the public are the thousands of stories on underreported issues that we have on our website. Our stories are updated multiple times a day and can be found at pulitcercenter.org/stories. We also offer many lesson plans at the elementary, middle, and high school level. All lesson plans examine journalism and require students to engage critical thinking skills. All of these lessons are also aligned to learning standards. If you become a teaching fellow, your unit plan will live in our lesson library. We offer 2 annual student writing contests. Our fall contest, Local Letters, encourages students to propose a local solution to a global issue in a letter to a state representative or lawmaker. Our spring contest, Fighting Words, is an opportunity for students to respond to underreported stories through poetry. We offer teachers and students the opportunity to host journalists in their classroom virtually in our virtual visit program. Journalists have discussed a range of topics with students, from the reporting process to the particulars of a global issue they've covered. If you're interested in hosting a journalist in your classroom, you can visit our website and look at our programs in the virtual visit program. And finally, we offer professional development for teachers throughout the year. One of our biggest PD opportunities and initiatives is the Teacher Fellowship. I'm going to pass it to the wonderful Hannah Burke to discuss the fellowship with all of you.
Thank you so much, Joya, and thank you all for your amazing contributions so far. I'm going to take us through a little bit of the basics of what the Teacher Fellowship is, but I'm going to keep this pretty brief because I want to make sure that we get to Tanya and Comfort's presentation soon, leave plenty of time for Q&A, and make sure that I direct you all to the links where you can find all of this information for yourself after today, and also get any questions that you want to answered. Basically, the Pulitzer Center Teacher Fellowship is a program that has existed for about 1 year. Our inaugural cohort took place in fall of 2020, and we brought on 51 fellows at this point for semester-long fellowships to spend time thinking about that mission that Joya shared with you earlier. How do we cultivate a curious, empathetic, informed, and actively engaged public through engagement with underreported stories and the journalists who cover them? And how can that integrate these underreported stories, these global issues that might spark students' interest? How can those integrate with existing curricula, the needs of your classroom, and the context that you're working in already? We're now extending our teacher fellowship for the first time to a year-long fellowship. And we're asking for applications through September 22nd. So this is an open opportunity right now for the upcoming year and something that we hope to continue in future years as well. Some basics on the logistics of this fellowship include that it is a paid virtual opportunity. All of our meetings take place via Zoom convenings, and there are stipends of $400 dispersed throughout that fellowship period at different points at the conclusion of different phases, which we'll talk about a little bit more. There's also a Pulitzer Center Official Teacher Fellow Badge, as well as credits, professional learning units that you can earn by participating in the sessions with journalists leading up to the creation of formal units. Many people are eligible for this fellowship. All classroom teachers working in any school within the United States and US territories within the grades of 4 through 12 are eligible, as well as anyone working with incarcerated individuals of any age in those locations. This year, we have a fellowship that will be open to folks anywhere nationwide, as well as one fellowship track that is exclusively open to educators in Chicago, Illinois. So if you are a Chicago-located teacher, consider if you'd like to join a very local cohort of educators who are thinking about these civic issues across the city that they teach in. In the past, we've had a wonderful range of fellows bring expertise and a lot of nuance into our conversations about media literacy, journalism skills, and underreported global issues. They've represented 17 states in Washington, D.C., grade levels from elementary through high school, and a whole range of different subjects, including English language arts and social studies, but also Spanish, math, sciences, and financial literacy in their classrooms. Essentially, we're looking for fellows who are excited about the work of journalism and global issues, but can be in any class context beyond that, whether that's geographically in terms of their subject area or in terms of the grade levels that they teach, because this content is all about figuring out how we can integrate that into the work that you're already doing and the learning goals that you have for your students. The fellowship takes place in primarily 3 different stages. The first stage is community building and workshops that cohorts do together, where you'll connect with award-winning journalists, the Pulitzer Center education team, and other amazing fellows from across the country or across the city of Chicago if you're part of that fellowship. These usually have guest speakers as part of them. Others are peer review workshops where you'll get feedback from Pulitzer staff and other educators. And these are just a few of the topics that we've explored in those sessions previously, which engage deeply with a global issue that a journalist has reported on, but also their process leading into those questions of media literacy, journalism ethics, and how those skills can be applied in the classroom and in students' lives, whether they're becoming journalists or just applying those thoughts of critical thinking and empathy and civic engagement in any aspects of their lives. This year's theme will be journalism and justice, elevating underreported stories in the classroom. And the second phase, after exploring some of these themes with journalists and other educators, will be to design, teach, and evaluate an original short unit plan, which can be anywhere from 3 to 10 lessons long. For your classroom. That involves writing some daily lesson plans, doing a performance task with students, so it's a bit of a project-based learning unit, and also getting a lot of student feedback along the way, informing that with your students' responses to what they're learning and revising that unit, both with feedback from your cohort mates and from your students as you go. The final phase of the fellowship involves publication and sharing this curriculum broadly. After fellows do this amazing work, we want to make sure that it gets out there and is freely available to as many folks as possible. So fellows units are published on the Pulitzer Center's lesson library, and they're also shared through professional development events like this one and others that we've held throughout the year. The fellowship community is very much an ongoing one that we hope to build with our wonderful alumni staying in touch with one another and considering both professional and personal opportunities for communication going forward. If you have any questions about the fellowship at this point, please think about jotting those down into the chat. Joya and I will be very happy to answer any logistical questions that you might have about all of this information that we just dropped after our presentations as well. But we want to make sure that we leave plenty of time to hear from some of our incredible past Teacher Fellow alumni. First today, we're going to be hearing from the wonderful Tanya Mohammed, who is a two-time Pulitzer Center Teaching Fellow from the fall and the spring semesters and has developed two amazing units. Tanya is an English language arts high school teacher in New York City, residing in Brooklyn. And we're so excited for you to get to hear a little bit more about the ways that she has been integrating journalism and social issues into her classroom, not only over the last year with the Pulitzer Center, but in her career as an educator. After we hear from Tanya, we're graced with Comfort Agboola's presence today. Comfort is an educator in Chicago who designed her unit for a fifth grade classroom in the city, but is now teaching sixth grade, staying with her class in her school. Thank you both so much for being here. For anyone who feels comfortable, can we just come off mute for one moment and send some hellos and thank yous to our educators before we get started with presentations?
Hi.
Hi, folks.
Thanks
Well,
for joining us.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everybody. And thank you to Tanya and Comfort for being here with us. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to start sharing those in the chat, but we'll make sure that we have some time a little bit later to be able to just get those answered all together as well. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tanya Mohammed to tell us a little bit more about herself and her experience with the fellowship.
Hi, thank you, Hannah. Okay, so I'm just gonna share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Okay, perfect. So hello. So just a little bit about me. I work at an international high school, Manhattan International High School, as a 10th and 11th grade ELA and ESL teacher. I'm from, as Hannah mentioned, I'm from Queens, but I live in Brooklyn now. And thinking back to last year, I think the main reason I applied to the fellowship was, it was remote learning. It was a completely new way of teaching, and I just really wanted to learn new ways of engaging students via a remote platform. And I was so curious to hear from like-minded journalists and educators and thinking about ways to promote civic engagement with students in a way that was meaningful and relevant to them. And when I'm not teaching, I am reading Austen adaptations, walking around the city, traveling, or looking for new experiences. And I just want to share some of the major highlights for the Pulitzer Center. I think it's such an amazing program for teachers, and I just, first of all, really wanted to highlight how excellent the staff members are. So including Joya, Hannah, Fareed. Anytime I had questions, if I reached out to them, they were available. I met with them one-on-one to discuss my unit ideas, as well as, once I created the units, to receive feedback and even resources. If I had an idea, but I wasn't sure like how to direct it, they were really good about helping me, either narrow down my ideas, broaden my ideas, or thinking about what would make most sense for my students. So I really appreciated that. The journalist visits. So this was such an amazing experience just to be able to interact with other professionals and in the journalism field and have a chance to interact with them directly. Once they completed their presentations, we had the opportunity to ask questions, and they were very gracious and thoughtful. So that was, I think, a major plus. And then, as I mentioned before, during remote teaching, I just needed new ways of getting in touch with my students and getting them to do work. But also, I think I've been teaching for now 8 years. And so at a certain point, I wanted to move, not just, have the traditional essay, think about other ways of getting students to show their learning. And so I really appreciated how this kind of forced me to think about what are some other ways that students can share their knowledge that also reflected some of the ways that these works were being presented to us. So through photo essays or public service announcements. And those are kind of the directions I took for the projects that students created. And so as Hannah mentioned, once we moved towards like the second and third stage of this fellowship, we had more opportunities to collaborate with other educators within the cohort and think about, sharing ideas, thinking about what worked in our unit, what questions, what could we add, what are some resources that might be helpful. And so that was a major aspect as well. And just to give you a quick overview of my unit, um, so the Pulitzer Center worked with the National Geographic for the project Women on the Move, which is posted on the website. And this project focused on the major reasons why women moved and were forced to migrate for a variety of reasons. And so I wanted students to create a public service announcement to answer the following question. And this is also the title of my unit. So why do migrants make the choices they make at different stages of migration? And then the PSA had a couple of pieces to it, but basically I wanted them to explain the different circumstances that lead women to migrate. What are to apply rhetorical appeals to really get other audiences, the audience members interested in the topic, and then include a call to action. And these are all the steps, but basically it was to figure out what article they wanted to focus on. Since there were 8, I asked them to choose one or at least one, think about which rhetorical appeal they wanted to use. How were they going to present their work? So they either could present it using an Canva and create an infographic, or some chose to create a video. And then there were opportunities for feedback. They posted their work on the school Instagram account, and then their final piece was to present their work in front of their peers, as well as write a reflection. So I just want to show. So this is, if you want to check it out, it's hashtag PSA Migrant Women, and this is what it looks like on Instagram, that students were able to kind of see each other's work. And then this is what it looks like on the website, Pulitzer Center website. So this is one of the students, and I just appreciate how this project allowed for students of all different levels to contribute and work on something that they were proud of and meaningful to them. So I thought I had students write reflections, and their reflections, I just kind of wrote down a part of what 3 of them wrote. So if you want to take 30 seconds to look at it, feel free. So I think again, like I just, one of the students, he said, I liked the project that we did. It really meant something. I felt like I didn't work just for grades, but I worked for grades at the same time to show that what's going on in the world. And I think he's not, a student who wrote great essays, but he was able to contribute and work on this and be proud of it. And so that was powerful. So I want to move on to the advice portion. And if you're remotely interested in this program, I recommend that you apply. It's such a great opportunity to connect with journalists, connect with educators, and thinking about, for me at least, thinking about how the personal insight I got into how journalists advocate for marginalized groups. And I also highly recommend you invite a journalist to the classroom. So for the spring fellowship, I invited Thana Farouk, who was a photographer for one of the articles in the National Geographic project. And the students were so interested in just talking to her, getting feedback, and asking her questions because they read her article beforehand. So they asked questions both about her, photographs and her work and her experience as a Yemeni refugee. And then, as I mentioned before, the staff are so great. So make sure to reach out to them for support if you need help, finding articles, finding resources, or just talking through about your unit. And I didn't mean to do that. So my key takeaways, I have been interested for a while of discussing real world issues with students, but I didn't always think of like a cohesive way of how to integrate that with the existing curricula. I have, state tests and other things to that I have to, kind of teach and go over with students. But I think by being a part of this fellowship, I've learned a better way of balancing all of the different standards and skills I have to go through along with this content. Again, it broadened my horizons and thinking of different ways to engage students. So photo essays, PSAs, videos, and then I just, in terms of students, I just saw how much more interested they were in being part of these projects. Both the photo essay that I did, because it focused on their communities, they were allowed to share, where they lived, what it looked like, and then this project also, because they were just given more choice. They were allowed to choose which article they wanted to focus on. They're allowed to choose how they wanted to present their work. And so I think all of those aspects really helped. And if you want to contact me, feel free to reach out to me at any time. Here is my email address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I hope you're seeing some love for your unit in the chat already. And folks, if you have questions about how Tanya did what she did with this amazing unit for her high school students, please go ahead and start dropping those into the chat, and we'll make sure that we make our way back to them. Thank you for being with us and sharing, Tanya. We are going to move to a presentation with Comfort Agboola in just a moment. Comfort, thank you so much for joining us today. And Comfort is an educator who was working with a 5th grade classroom in thank you so much for sharing. In a 5th grade classroom in the spring semester, and we'll be working with 6th grade this fall. So thank you for joining us in your 2nd week of school, Comfort, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you now.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be sharing my unit and talking about how my students grew as journalists. So, okay. I'm currently teaching middle school, and last year I taught 5th grade. So I'm looping with my students again and still building on some of the skills that we started in the spring. So my experience with the Pulitzer Center Fellowship, if I could sum it up, it was amazing. It was eye-opening for me and my students. So how I started off with wanting to do this, my students were terrified of the news. They didn't watch it. They didn't like it when it came on, when their parents were watching it. They would go into the other room and play their video games or watch something else, but it was frightening for them. I think that part of it was always sort of focused towards adults and their thoughts and their knowledge base. But also students didn't see themselves reporting. And this allowed them to not only consume, but also report the news. So my unit is called Better Than Normal, Amplifying Hope and Action in Our Community. So this project was outlining 3 areas of opportunity in our community. So focusing on the Roseland and Pullman area in Chicago. Throughout the investigation, students examined multiple perspectives on education, the environment, and racism. These were 3 issues that they wanted to focus on. They asked critical questions. They used articles from the Pulitzer Center along with videos. So one aspect that was really helpful, especially for elementary students, is having different media platforms for them to engage with the news. And Pulitzer Center provides a lot of resources along those lines. So this is a Padlet that we created together. So there are some topics and key terms that it was very important for us to have a unified definition of different things as we're reporting. So as if we're talking about the topic of bias, we all have the same definition. And the students put their ideas, they put their pictures, some of them put voice recordings, whatever way they wanted to express the meaning of that word in their own terms, they were open to. This is based off of a video. So this is a student response. We watched a short clip of 100 years of protests. And I wanted them to take away the idea that the news and reporting the news can be a form of protest and civic action. So even as a young person, you have a voice. And this was showing how protests have changed over 100 years. And then this is a focus on the topic of schooling. So since they were all remote learning, and this was a big topic of their focus, how come some students have access to this at their home and some students have access to this? How can they highlight that there's inequity in education? And how has it existed even before remote learning? So my students in 5th grade were able to consume this information and process through it and explain it to their peers and explain it to a broader audience. And I think that goes back to the point that adults are not just the only ones that report the news, but so are students. This was a very, I think this is something that they still remember and probably still will ask, is Joya coming back? Is Tony Briscoe coming back? So this was their journalist visit, and I was just blown away at the level of questioning, how it connected to even our science unit. So we were studying the water cycle, and they were asking questions about the environment and environmental racism. And it just so happened during this time in the Pullman area, there was a water shut off. So they were asking questions about that and filtration systems, and they were researching and finding out where does their water get filtered to, and this was all student-led. So student responses. So students became journalists, researching, reporting, and spreading information to their audience. So previously they had fear about the news. They only saw it on major broadcasting systems, but they were able to make memes, podcasts, videos, voiceover videos, and report and become storytellers, but also stronger become journalists. So they were using their modes of communication. So these are some clips. I don't think they're playing, but they are available on the Pulitzer Center website. That's one video from a student, and it's just like a short clip about racism.
Comfort, should I try to play it?
Yeah, maybe will play.
Racial injustice in America. What is racism? Racism affects tons of people of color every day. Racism is when a person is treated unfairly because of their race or features, like skin, eyes, hair, etc. Some examples of racism are being denied jobs, searched, and even bullied for how you look. Systemic racism is a big problem in America. It is also known as structural or institutional racism. Systemic racism is when a system is built to disadvantage people of color. How did the pandemic worsen these problems? Racial inequality has worsened since the pandemic started. There has been a lot of deaths caused because of racism. For example, 2 deaths that occurred because of racism are George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor's death. As a result, people of color started fighting for their rights more. They did peaceful protests to do so. Some people took advantage of this though, seeing the peaceful protests as a way to get away with crimes and frame the protesters. We have come far in fighting for equal rights, but we still have a long way to go. More recent racial inequality. Recently, Asians have been getting hate crimed. What is a hate crime, you may be thinking? A hate crime is a crime that is motivated by prejudice of race, religion, sexual orientation, etc. These crimes have been happening to Asians a lot recently. Asians are being killed, attacked, spat on, and blamed for the coronavirus. We need to stop the hate on people of color because we are all equal, regardless of if we are Black, Asian, Native, Latino, white, and more.
Applause to that student, and passing it back to you, Comfort.
So as my reflection, at moment when I see what everyone was talking about learning loss, it was powerful for our community of learners and educators that students' voices were amplified, their lives were being shared, and this is all happening during a pandemic. I learned so much about my students, more than I ever would have in a typical year. It was not about tests. It was all about issues that they were facing and they cared about. Providing them with the means to tell their stories and creating a partnership between us. That was like the really powerful part. And now that I'm working with them in person, we have this bond and connection because we've talked about deep issues. So my advice, let your students guide your units. So give them control, give them the driver's seat. Be open to multiple media platforms and format, whatever they're comfortable with. Journalist visits, so yes, include those in. Having students connect with a professional in the field and them being viewed as professionals will elevate things. And then take time to reflect on the process. I think that's it.
Looking for the unmute button. Thank you so much for your incredible presentation, Comfort. Let's give Comfort some applause. Let's do it on the count of 3. Unmute yourself and tell Comfort how amazing she is. And let's also give props to Tanya for her incredible presentation. Let's do it at 3. 1, 2, 3.
Woohoo!
Thank
you so much.
Loved it all. Comfort.
Both the presentations were very good.
Thank you guys so
Thank
much
you.
for your positive feedback. And Tanya, Comfort, I hope you're seeing some of the praise and the excitement in the chat. We are moving on to the Q&A portion of this conversation. I want to give everybody a moment. If you want to type your question in the chat, if you don't want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to do that. And we're looking for your questions and we'll read them for you. But I'm also encouraging all of you wonderful participants that have been so engaged throughout this conversation to unmute yourself and ask your questions yourself. I see you, so if you want to raise your hand, please do that, and I will call on you. So while people are coming up with questions, I might start this conversation off with a couple questions from the Pulitzer Center. So here we go. So this question is for both Tanya and Comfort, and this maybe can launch our conversation. What advice, and maybe let's start with Tanya since Comfort sort of gave us some advice. Tanya, what advice would you give teachers who might be incorporating global news and issues into their classroom, maybe for the first time? Comfort had mentioned that her students were scared of the news, and this unit really helped to change that relationship. So let's start with you, Tanya, and then Comfort, I'd love to hear your feedback as well. What would you say to teachers who are new to incorporating news in their classrooms?
I guess I would say start small. Maybe they can start with thinking about local news of like what's happening just, in their community. And then, just thinking of like different ways of what's considered news. What does it mean to look at the news and read the news and share the news? And then after that, maybe just like put them in the position of like thinking about what's happening locally that they can perhaps report on before they start thinking about looking at websites to gather resources, and looking at news that's more like global. Yeah.
Thank you, Tanya. Comfort, do you have any additions, anything that you'd like to add?
I think with my students, I started off asking them, could TikTok be news? And that really engaged them. And then I asked them to sort of define what news is. So we could piece together a definition of what news is before I just give them a definition.
Thank you, Comfort. So I'm seeing a question from Colette that I'm going to read out loud, and thank you for your contribution. This question is for Tanya. Did you think of including a biography, a memoir, or a novel to the immigration unit?
So right before this unit, they read Homegoing by Jesse, some of you are, so that was a part of, like, I think they got an understanding of movement and why people move from one location to another, but it wasn't directly like what it's kind of, they worked on the novel, and then I had to think of, well, how are they going to now move on to this. So it's two separate projects, but in the future I think it would be interesting to have a memoir, and then think about how students can incorporate that into this type of project.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Tanya. And just to that question, more generally, did want to note, and I'll drop a link in the chat to our Stories of Migration cohort unit, that there were a number of literature teachers who did tie their units this year to some very specific texts. I know we had one teacher in Hawaii, Edith, who did a whole unit on The Tempest, where students did really intensive reading aloud of the play, and tied the play and each act within it to different themes of othering and migration. So there are a number of examples in that cohort of those literary connections as well.
So just like Hannah referenced, I've dropped the link for all of the units on migration, and you'll notice the units that incorporate literature there. Robert, I've noticed that you've unmuted a couple times. I just want to give you an opportunity to ask a question if you have one.
Question and maybe more of a comment, especially listening to Comfort Agboola, when she was speaking of, and I'm glad you brought up the situation with your students about was social media news or how the aspect of it. And I think that was great because we've dealt with that on a university level. And I'm just so proud that you've dealt with that with your students because I've had comments of people saying to me that they made a comment on something and said it was on the news. I said, now, I'm a news junkie. I've never seen that. They said, oh, the other news. So wait a minute, what is the other news? Oh, that's the stuff I see on Facebook or something to that TikTok or something to that effect. And that's when I get into the fact I said, please just take a course, one course, or get some information on introduction to journalism and mass communication and see what news is. Just start getting a differentiation. And the other aspect of it that by dealing with the students, those young minds that you're dealing with, it helps move us out what I call the dumbing down of our nation, our community, our people. Let's start teaching our students. I know that sometimes I hear a high school teachers say, well, you got to start preparing students right around the 11th grade to go to college, not the 12th grade. I said, no, I go further back into junior high. Because if you're preparing students at that time, just for anything, not just preparing to go to college, but preparing for a career, and in this case, who and what are journalists and what do they do, you must start a lot earlier. So I want to commend you for doing that with those young minds.
Thank you, Robert. Appreciating so many things that you've said, talking about the importance of journalists, supporting our elementary educators who are doing incredible work in their classroom. I think hearing Robert talk a little bit about some of these issues also points to the importance of community, of us working together to support each other and not only imagining these units and processing the news, but considering ways to make them accessible to our students. So thank you so much for being an example of that today. I'm seeing a question from Amy. Amy, since it's in the chat, I'm going to read it, if that's okay, unless you'd like to unmute. So I've got it then. For younger students, and I'm thinking of Comfort's unit of study, did you encounter any resistance from families about some of the issues that would be raised in the study? If so, what kinds of support did you get from the center and your school administration? Great question, Amy. Thank you.
Through the center, I was able to get media release forms and just a wealth of information to just sort of summarize what the Pulitzer Center does. I started off with that. So before I started the units or lessons, I started with that introduction to parents, just so that they are aware what we're talking about. And a lot of parents were really pleased because they are used to textbook. And they were kind of happy that they could talk with their kid about what they were learning in school because they were also watching it on the news. So it sort of made that connection to home. And the student of the video that was shown, her father actually hosted a Zoom session where she was showing her video to other people. So they really built a community around that, where now students are talking to their parents about what they're learning in school.
Thank you, Comfort. And just a follow-up question from Colette, what about introducing young activists and their actions in your classroom?
A lot of the students were familiar with like Malala and other people that we have like textbooks for, and but just diving a little bit deeper. So there were some students that did their own research and found on TikTok this student that was teaching sign language in short videos. So they were looking at how different media platforms can be useful and not just part of the backlog of misinformation, but how can they turn those media around? Students also use memes, so they were really into that, and taking some familiar faces and characters and turning them so that they make their own message. And I would say that most of the students are very familiar with young activists, probably more than I am. So they were introducing me to some people that I wasn't as familiar with.
Thank you, Comfort. We may have more questions, and Hannah and I are going to stick around after the webinar for anyone who has additional questions. But at this time, I'm going to pass it back to Hannah, who's going to finish our session off today.
Thank you so much. And another big thank you both to our teacher fellows who are here with us today, and to all of you for these really wonderful questions and comments that you've shared with us. We're looking forward to continuing this conversation, whatever form that takes. And in that spirit, I just want to share with you a couple of links where you can go to find out more about this fellowship or other opportunities to get involved in the Pulitzer Center teacher community this fall and this school year. All of these slides are going to come your way via email afterwards, so you'll have these embedded links in here as well. As we mentioned before, the fellowship application for the 2021 to 2022 school year is due September 22nd. To get all of the details on that, here's a very involved blog post that I'll share with you the descriptions of those fellowships and eligibility, all of the things that we talked about today. And I also want to highlight in this long post the key dates for the tracks. So if you are considering joining us, just know that there's a place for you to find out when we're going to be meeting, what the schedule will look like, both in terms of logistical things like payments, and for when we'll be meeting, workshopping, and connecting with one another. This will also take you to a submittable application that you can fill out for the session. There's an eligibility form, which is just a couple of quick check boxes, and then it'll take you to a longer form where you'll tell us a little bit about yourself, your class, and your goals for the fellowship. And this is where we have a chance to get to know you a little bit better, and what you're looking for from this community and how you might fit into it for the fall. So please check that out. We would love to look at applications from every single person in this room, and know that we're also here for you if you have more questions. We'll be sticking around for a few minutes after our session today, but we're also always available via email if things come up while you're filling this out and you want to get in touch with us. Even if you decide not to apply for the Pulitzer Center Teacher Fellowship this year, please stay in touch with us. As Tanya and Comfort both mentioned, we have virtual journalist visits that are available not just to our fellows, but to any educator who reaches out. And I know some folks in this room have participated in those virtual visits and in some of our past student contests. Our local Letters for Global Change contest is launching just this Wednesday, this upcoming Wednesday. So lots of things going on at the Pulitzer Center this fall, including professional development opportunities like this one that are open to everyone. So encourage you to sign up for our weekly education newsletter where we share those opportunities, as well as our Facebook group if you're on Facebook, where we'll also be sharing that information. And always reach out to us. We're happy to answer questions that you have, but also to get on the phone and brainstorm. We are a small team at the Pulitzer Center, so this education at email comes directly to Joya and me and a couple of our colleagues. So we'll be happy to talk with you about your class context and how we can support the wonderful work that you're doing with your students anytime. And the last thing that I want to share with you today is just a link to take a quick survey to help us continue improving our programs and make these better for all of you. So thank you so much for the folks who are watching this online afterwards, and for recording today's session. We'll send this survey your way as well. And to everybody in the room, just thank you so much for spending an hour of your time in this extremely busy season, both with everything that's going on with back to school and the constant adjustments in that world, and everything going on outside of it in our personal and community lives. So we're very happy to be with you. Hope to see many applications from this group, and we're going to be sticking around for a few minutes afterward if you have more questions.